Where some of the ideas came from for my class today. Myself and my girlfriend, sister Vanessa, we've been participating or had been participating in a free program that's run by some of the Ivy League schools, where you can essentially sign up for a free course as a auditor, so to speak. So you don't get the credit for it, but you can sit in on the classes and you get the materials and everything. So that's kind of neat. So we signed up for a philosophy course on the philosophy of justice, and it tackled elements of moral philosophy, and it kind of got the wheels turning a little bit. And some of the ideas here are that they sprung from that course that we were sitting in on, and a couple of the resources as well. And then I sort of looked at things from a biblical perspective, and I think kind of fleshed out some pretty interesting things here. So I'm going to start with a story. This is a real life story that happened in the summer of 1884. So, in the summer of 1884, four English sailors were stranded at sea in a small lifeboat in the South Atlantic, about 1,000 miles from land. Their ship, which was called the Mignonette, had gone down in a storm, and they had escaped to the lifeboat with only 2 cans of preserved turnips and no fresh water. Thomas Dudley was the captain, Edwin Stevens, the first mate, and Edmund Brooks was a sailor, and they were all later called men of excellent character. The fourth member of the crew was the cabin boy, whose name was Richard Parker, and he was 17 years old. And if any of you have read the book Life of Pi, you might recognize that name from one of the characters in that book, which was based on this true story. He was an orphan, and on his first long voyage at sea. He had signed up against the advice of his friends in the hopefulness of youthful ambition, thinking that the journey would make a man of him. Sadly, that was not to be. From the lifeboat, the four stranded sailors watched the horizon, hoping a ship might pass and rescue them. For the first 3 days, they ate small rations of turnips. On the fourth day, they caught a turtle, and they subsisted on turtle and the remaining turnips for the next few days. Then for 8 days, they ate absolutely nothing. By now, Parker, the cabin boy, was lying in the corner of the lifeboat. He had drunk seawater against the advice of the others, and he'd become ill. He appeared to be dying. On the 19th day of their ordeal, Dudley, the captain, suggested drawing lots to determine who would die so that the others might live. Brooks refused, so they did not draw lots. The next day, still no ship in sight. Dudley told Brooks to avert his gaze and motioned to Stevens that Parker would be killed. Dudley offered a prayer, told the boy his time had come, and then killed him with a penknife. Brooks emerged from his conscientious objection to share in the gruesome bounty. For 4 days, the three men fed on the body and blood of the cabin boy, and then they were rescued. Dudley describes their rescue in his diary with a kind of a staggering euphemism. He says, "On the 24th day, as we were having our breakfast, a ship appeared at last. The three survivors were picked up, and upon their return to England, they were arrested and tried. Brooks turned state's witness. Brooks was the one who had protested the casting of lots initially, and Dudley and Stevens went to trial. They freely confessed that they had killed and eaten Parker, and they claimed that they had done so out of necessity. The strongest argument for the defense is that given the dire circumstances, it was necessary to kill one person in order to save three. Had no one been killed and eaten, all four would likely have died. Parker, weakened and ill, was the logical candidate, since he would soon have died anyway. And unlike Dudley and Stevens, he had no dependents. His death deprived no one of support and left no grieving wife or children. This argument is open to at least two objections. First, it can be asked whether the benefits of killing the cabin boy taken as a whole really did outweigh the costs. Even counting the number of lives saved and happiness of the survivors and their families, allowing such a killing might have bad consequences for society as a whole, for example, weakening the norm against murder, or increasing people's tendency to take the law in their own hands, or making it more difficult for captains to recruit cabin boys. Secondly, even if all things considered, the benefits do outweigh the costs, don't we have a nagging sense that killing and eating a defenseless cabin boy is wrong for reasons that go beyond the calculation of social costs and benefits? Isn't it wrong to use a human being in this way, exploiting his vulnerability, taking his life without his consent, even if doing so benefits others? To anyone appalled by the actions of Dudley and Stevens, the first objection seems tepid. It accepts the assumption that morality consists in weighing costs and benefits. If the killing of the cabin boy is worthy of moral outrage, the second objection is more to the point. It rejects the idea that the right thing to do is simply a matter of calculating consequences, and it suggests rather that morality means something more, something to do with the proper way for human beings to treat one another. These two ways of thinking about the lifeboat, this historical case, illustrate two rival approaches. The first approach says the morality of an action depends solely on the consequences it brings about. The right thing to do is whatever will produce the best state of affairs, all things considered. The second approach says that consequences are not the only thing to care about, morally speaking. Certain duties and rights should command our respect for reasons independent of social consequence. So that little blurb that I just shared with you was taken from the moral philosophy course that we were working through. So I want to hit the pause button on that for a moment. Keep that story in mind. We will be circling back to it. I want you to hang with me for a little while here as we explore some passages that will kind of help to tie things together. So feel free to look these up as we go, but I'll probably go through them relatively quickly and I'll read them out for you. So it's entirely up to you. So I'm going to start with Romans 3, and I'm going to read from 21 to 26. So Romans 3, beginning of verse 21. But now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. This righteousness is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. There is no difference between Jew and Gentile, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and all are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith. He did this to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance he had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. He did it to demonstrate his righteousness at the present time, so as to be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. So Paul writes here about God putting forth Christ as a sacrifice of atonement. And Paul could have said something along the lines of, God punished Christ for having sin, but he certainly doesn't say that. He could have said that Christ's death was a substitute for us, and he doesn't say that either. Paul prescribes the appropriate response to this self-sacrifice and sort of ties this into the example we were given in the Old Testament. But he ties this for us in Romans 12, where he recommends a commitment of reciprocity with Christ's sacrifice by us as believers. So in Romans 12, the first couple of verses, he says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." Righteous self-sacrifice includes obedience in response to God, and that is giving or presenting ourselves, including our will, to God in response and certainly against any contrary will of our own. So the sacrifice is it's not a ritual or an external practice or a demonstration of physical suffering, but rather a spirit of sacrifice. We have the example of Jesus in Gethsemane as a model of righteous self-sacrifice to God, in line with Paul's focus on Jesus' self-giving obedience to God in his willing death, where we're told in Philippians 2. Just to kind of back up a little further and look at the origin of sacrifice, the idea of like what is sacrifice in the first place. I'm just going to read from Exodus 3:18, and in one of the earliest sort of mentions of this sacrifice after the garden. Um, the elders of Israel. So this is Exodus 3:18. The elders of Israel will listen to you. Then you and the elders are to go to the king of Egypt and say to him, "The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices." So this is the original request that Moses made to Pharaoh for Israel to be set free. And I think there's some really interesting parallels here, considering we're talking about Egypt, and God's requirement for them to leave Egypt and go and sacrifice. The reason was that they might be free to be able to sacrifice to their God. And the same principle applies to us. This is why God has freed us from Egypt. Recall that Romans 12:1 charges us with the responsibility, once we are free of our slavery to sin, to be living sacrifices. The blessing of our God-given calling makes available to us the opportunity to dedicate our lives in service to Him. And its potential opens the door to positive motivation to counterbalance maybe the somewhat negative sense that obligation to Christ may otherwise seem to impose. Because he first gives us evidence of his love for us, it enables us to believe in him, to live by faith, to live a life of self-sacrifice, and to glorify him. The just shall live by faith because they know him in his loving character. This causes any lingering negative sense, or can cause, not in every case, uh, the negative sense that human nature has toward being required to keep God's commands to sort of fade to the background, freeing us to obey from the heart in sincere gratitude and joy. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 2 and 3 says, "Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." So there's an example here of the fact that God presented difficulties for the Israelites to face, and a good parallel to show us that the real tests never come at a convenient time. So if we're being tested in terms of our willingness to sacrifice ourselves and to participate in Christ's sacrifice, those tests are not going to come at the easy times. The more difficult choices seem to come in times of hardship, when our loyalty is really in question, and when it's much easier to serve ourselves. And obviously we can connect that to the initial story here. However, God wants us to sacrifice ourselves instead. Psalm 51 tells us that as a converted man, David understood that animal sacrifices were really not doing anything other than setting a pattern. Certainly, they were tutors to those who understood, but the Israelites could sacrifice 1,000 animals and not get a thing out of it, as David understood. He writes, "For you do not desire sacrifice, or else I would give it. You do not delight in burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart." That really costs us something, what David is talking about. The person sacrifices of himself when human nature is being cut away, when by the exercise, or the exercise of his will due to faith, determines not to do something, or to do something against every fiber of his being, even as Jesus did. By the force of will and through faith, by relying on God, by dedicating ourselves in servitude to him, we can make ourselves to do something, just to stay in line with him, when every part of our natural selves is telling us it's going to be much easier for us if we go this other way. It says, "These, O God, you will not despise." Okay, so having just kind of scratched the surface on the idea of sacrifice and self-sacrifice, I'm sure you're seeing some connection with the beginning story, but I'm going to tie it in a lot more as we go along. Um, I'd like to look at another real life moral dilemma as well, but first I want to examine an ethical belief system that influence both our opening story and the story I'm going to share next. And I think it also has a huge influence on our modern society. And certainly for myself, I can speak for myself, but I think I can speak for a lot of us, that this is a philosophy that is really pervasive, and is difficult to avoid in our modern society, particularly in the Western world. And this is the philosophy of utilitarianism. So for those who don't know, utilitarianism is an ethical theory that determines right from wrong by focusing on outcomes. So it's a form of consequentialism, and it holds that the most ethical choice is the one that will produce the greatest good for the greatest number. Essentially, it amounts to that. So it kind of doesn't sound bad right off the bat, but we might see some flaws when we start digging into it a little bit. So one of the one of the big issues with it is that in order to be able to assess what the right thing to do is in a given situation, since it's based on outcomes, we must have some way of knowing what the possible outcomes are going to be. Since we're not clairvoyant, we can't see the future, we don't have all the factors at all times, and we are fallible. This opens us up to major possibility for miscalculation, and mistakes, and we can't factor in um, anything else that might come along. This philosophy also requires us to be able to evaluate what is the greatest good for the greatest number. And in order to be able to determine what is the greatest good or the greatest benefit, we have to have a way of quantifying and qualifying degrees of good and less good. So there has to be some sort of universally accepted measurement system to be able to quantify the various goods for a society. This, as you're probably already kind of thinking about this piece of it, what this ends up doing as well, because it depends on people's views of what is a benefit and what is not a benefit in society, that it creates a sort of fluid or relative morality. Since the right or wrong thing to do changes based on other variables. It changes on the thoughts of the time. It can change on the weather. Can change based on where the income is distributed. Yeah, all kinds of different things. So it creates a little bit of a catch-22, since it makes it impossible to quantify in certain terms, therefore, what is good and what is evil, or what is less good, and therefore, what is better or worse for the majority. So, kind of digging into all those flaws, and these are accepted flaws of the philosophy, we might think it's kind of easy to avoid to a certain extent, but I think that we'd be wrong if we think that. It is absolutely pervasive in our modern world. Basically, the whole idea of democracy as a political system is based on utilitarian ideals, the greatest good for the greatest number. Wars throughout history have been justified through the lens of achieving or defending the greatest good for the greatest number. Atrocities have been committed in the name of protecting the majority from perceived dangers of a minority or a smaller group. And it's easy to fall into this way of thinking on everyday minor things as well. So, for example, the thought, you know, maybe this thing that I'm doing is wrong, but you know what? It's not hurting anyone. That's kind of a consequentialist form of thinking. It can come up even just when we're trying to figure out how to allot our time. So if we're looking at, maybe this will benefit, or this will get out to a larger number of people, rather than me spending all this time trying to help this one person who's maybe really a difficult person to work with. So we're looking at sort of what the greater number of people who are affected by it. It can come up in all kinds of different ways, and I think it's really pervasive. So just to dig in a little bit further on this and compare it to, I guess, what we could call biblical ethics. Utilitarianism is a purely consequentialist moral theory where other kinds of moral consideration matter only to the extent that their adoption has good or bad consequences. Scriptural ethics, on the other hand, routinely make use of concepts relating to duty and virtuous character, independence of possible consequence. So we have numerous biblical texts, and particularly in the Old Testament, that speak about ethical rules being established by God's commandments and about the importance of obedience to God's laws. Routinely, acts are portrayed as evil without any reference to their consequences. Often we're told that an action is evil, and we don't know the rest of the story. We don't know if it led to anything bad or not. So it wasn't clearly important for God to get that across to us. In Romans 3:8, Paul seems to take it for granted that it's problematic to reason, "Let us do evil so that good may come." So that's a pretty good argument, I think, against the idea of consequentialism. And if it seems like there's a chasm between the Bible and the utilitarian ethic, forgiveness can serve as a particularly clear case in point. For utilitarians, acting wrongly means acting in a way that reduces the total benefit to a society or a community. One can thus act wrongly, but one can't necessarily wrong an individual per se. And without such directed duties, the central Christian idea of forgiveness is hard to incorporate. Since utilitarians do not consider duties to be about right relations between individuals, except maybe as it applies to justice, and part of that would be tied to precedent and making sure that the society as a whole has rules to follow, rather than really trying to sort out the issues between two individuals. But rather, it's about the relation of the individual to the benefit. So forgiveness would not be a practice in which a wrong party has the moral power, really, to waive rights for compensation or retribution, or to eliminate guilt. In other words, there's no room for forgiveness. And if we kind of extrapolate that a little bit, we think of it in terms of if the moral right under the utilitarian idea is whatever will benefit the most people the most, then if we do something that causes a benefit to a smaller number of people, or causes a deficit to a larger group, the right thing then for that larger group to do in response is whatever benefits the greater whole again. So in what scenario is it going to benefit the greater whole to forgive the individual who committed the first crime? Another point that connects us back to the idea of self-sacrifice is that the Bible references the familiar concept of going beyond the call of duty. So going above and beyond the letter of the law and really adhering to the spirit of the law. And, Jesus talks about how basically under the old law, it says, "Thou shalt not murder," but he implores us to not even have that hate for our brother. It's that the spirit of the law, and it's acknowledged both in the scriptural teaching as well as in common sort of moral intuition. The Bible seems to draw a contrast between merely avoiding wrongdoing and going above and beyond, and sort of the minimum calling. When Jesus criticizes the legalism of the Pharisees, he contrasts it with justice and mercy and faithfulness in Matthew 23, reminiscent of similar contrast to the Old Testament in Micah 6, for example. And perhaps most pointedly in this case, in 1 Corinthians 13:3, sees something lacking in a kind of altruism that gives all possessions to the poor, but doesn't exhibit the virtue of love. So this seems to indicate that the result of the actions does not necessarily make the action itself a moral one. Now, it's interesting to look at consequentialism in the Bible, because despite all of these sort of non-utilitarian features that I've just shared with you, there are many cases where consequences do have, of course, a role in determining the rightness of actions. So there's some interesting examples in the Bible, in many key cases, such as, for example, the prohibition of killing or the injunction to help the needy, where clearly consequences are considered. And the relevance of these consequences may be most obvious in cases where rules seem to be approvingly broken. They're spoken of as righteous people, for example, when they have broken some of these rules God has put in place in order to effect a better consequence. So the Egyptian midwives who lied to the Pharaoh to save Hebrew infants are praised. David and his men break an explicit commandment of the Torah by eating the showbread while fleeing Saul, which Jesus uses as an argument later to defend his disciples plucking grain on the Sabbath. And it's notable in that case that the good consequence in question here is nothing more than essentially a satiating hunger. We know, of course, that Jesus heals on the Sabbath numerous times, and even tells a healed man to carry his sleeping mat. He criticizes the Pharisees' disapproval of his actions by appealing to a verse from Hosea that again harkens back to what we read in Psalms before from David, that I desire mercy and not sacrifice. In fact, a strict and superficial focus on rule observance is given really critical treatment throughout both the Old and New Testament. However, love is at the center of biblical morality. So while love does fall in line in some regards to utilitarian ethics, love goes beyond promoting the welfare of loved ones and of those around them. In addition, even if universal, love is directed at individuals as well. And so therefore, an ethic with love and self-sacrifice at its center is really hard to reconcile to utilitarianism, and there's some big gaps there. It's interesting to note that many attempts to explain why certain destructive actions of God in the Bible, like the flood of the flood or the annihilation of the Canaanites, for example, maybe from certain perspective, from a temporal perspective, in some cases, it's hard to say, that was morally right. And we can sort of fall in some cases into consequentialist reasoning. So the actions will be justified and compatible with God's benevolence because ultimately they had good effects, such as stopping the spread of evil. But the Bible's attention to consequence doesn't give it a consequentialist outlook. And the distinguishing feature of consequentialism is the exclusive attention to consequences, which makes it susceptible to change as the perception of good evolves in a society, for example. Furthermore, and this is the big key, and I'll hammer this a little bit later as well, any seeming consequentialism in the Bible is based on God's omniscience rather than on our best guesses. So when we're talking about God making a decision or taking action based on what the consequences are going to be, it's entirely different than when we try to do so ourselves, because we don't know the end from the beginning, and we are not omniscient and omnipresent. So I told you I'd share another real life story, and I'm gonna launch into that here. And there was actually, some of you may have seen, there was a movie made about this story, true story that happened in 2005. There was a special forces team made up of Petty Officer Marcus Luttrell and 3 other U.S. Navy SEALs, and they set out on a secret reconnaissance mission in Afghanistan near the Pakistan border in search of a Taliban leader who was a close associate of Osama bin Laden. According to intelligence reports, their target commanded 140 to 150 heavily armed fighters and was staying in a village in the forbidding mountainous region. Shortly after, the Special Forces team took up a position on a mountain ridge overlooking a village. 2 Afghan farmers with about 100 bleeding goats happened upon them. With them was a boy of about 14 years old. The Afghan farmers were unarmed. The American soldiers trained their rifles on them, motioned them to sit on the ground, and then tried to decide what to do. On the one hand, the goat herds appeared to be unarmed civilians. On the other hand, letting them go would run the risk that they would inform the Taliban of the presence of the U.S. soldiers. As the 4 soldiers contemplated their options, They thought about tying them up, and they didn't have any rope or any means to do so. They looked at some other options, and they basically determined that they really only had two choices. One was to kill them, and one was to let them go free. One of Luttrell's comrades argued for killing the goatherds. What he said was, "We're on active duty behind enemy lines, sent here by our senior commanders. We have a right to do everything we can to save our own lives. The military decision is obvious. To turn them loose would be wrong." Luttrell, who was in charge, was more torn. "In my soul, I knew he was right," he wrote in retrospect. "We could not possibly turn them loose. But my trouble is I have another soul, my Christian soul, and it was crowding in on me. Something kept whispering in the back of my mind, it would be wrong to execute these unarmed men in cold blood." In the end, his conscience didn't allow him to kill the goatherds. He cast the deciding vote. So there was four of them. One voted for, one abstained, or excuse me, one abstained. One had voted in favor of letting them go, so he was the deciding vote. It was a vote that he came to regret. About an hour and a half after they released the goatherds, the four soldiers found themselves surrounded by 80 Taliban fighters armed with AK-47s and rocket-propelled grenades. In the firefight that followed, all three of Luttrell's comrades were killed. The Taliban fighters also shot down a U.S. helicopter that sought to rescue the SEAL unit, killing all 16 soldiers on board. Luttrell, who was severely injured, managed to survive by falling down the mountainside and crawling 7 miles to the nearby village. And in an interesting turn that I think illustrates more to the point, the residents of that village then actually risked their own lives to save him. And then he was eventually rescued. In retrospect, Luttrell condemned his own vote not to kill the goatherds. He said, "It was the stupidest, most southern fried, lame-brained decision I ever made in my life. I must have been out of my mind. I had actually cast a vote which I knew could sign our death warrant. At least that's how I look on that now. The deciding vote was mine, and it will haunt me till the rest of my days." So, returning to Romans 12 again, I think there's a very nice contrast here to this the thinking we're hearing from him. And again, I think it's interesting to see his philosophy now, looking back on this, clearly taking a consequentialist view of this. He's saying that it turned out this was the wrong thing to do because people died. If we look at what the villagers did, he may be viewing that as, they risked their lives and they risked calamity in order to help him. But again, it worked out. So maybe that was why it was the right thing to do in their case. So I want to use Romans 12 for some contrast. We'll pick up at verse 9. "Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor, serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, 'It is mine to avenge, I will repay,' says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head." I think it's clear that God does not prescribe consequentialist morality in Scripture. We have all kinds of examples in the Bible of people who made difficult decisions for righteousness' sake, and those decisions led to hardship and suffering. And I'm sure we can all think of a different example of that. In some sense, it can be argued that ultimately we are instructed by God to act morally in a way that does work towards the greatest cumulative good. So, for example, if we turn back a couple of pages to Romans 8, starting at verse 28, we're told, we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. For whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he did predestinate, them he also called, and whom he called, them he also justified. Whom he justified, them he also glorified. What shall we then say to these things? If God be for us, who can be against us? He that spared not his own Son, but delivered him up for us, how shall he not? How shall he not with him also freely give us all things? And here we are, by the way, as an aside, back at the idea of self-sacrifice. I'm not going to delve into the predestination aspect here. I think that's a topic for another day. But we are told here that our moral decisions are directed by a greater final cause, just as proponents of utilitarian ethic would argue. However, as I mentioned before, the major difference is that the actual directive as to what is right and what is wrong in a given moment comes from our Creator, as opposed to some kind of best guess on our part based on unknowable variables. Matthew 10. I'm going to read Matthew 10, verses 32 through about 39. Whoever acknowledges me before others, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever disowns me before others, I will disown before my Father in heaven. Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household. Anyone who loves the father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. I wanted to read these verses to illustrate something that I think that I struggle with, and that is that the sacrifice of Christ for us can mean certainly both the forgiveness part, and can represent Christ's own example of self-denial and losing his life for a greater purpose, which is really to great personal cost. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 1:18, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those who are being saved, it is the power of God." I think the second part of it can be kind of hard to swallow sometimes. So we have an example of complete surrender, which we are called to imitate. Um, and I think if we're not following that, we can easily become tolerant of sin, or increasingly human-centered and less inclined to actions that might involve great discomfort or inconvenience. We can appreciate what Christ's sacrifice means for us while simultaneously balking at the cost to follow in his footsteps. But for those of us who have answered God's calling, that message and example of total surrender, of carrying whatever's placed upon us and until we die, is powerful. And consider the power unleashed when Jesus surrenders to this completely. We know that God not only raised him back to life, but he has put all things under him. Following that example of self-sacrifice is what could have allowed, we're told it could have allowed the Corinthians to be reconciled to each other. The carnal mind says that the surrender is folly because it creates a vulnerability or the possibility of loss or great hardship. But the same carnal mind is blind to the reality that God is on his throne overseeing the outcome. He uses his power on our behalf, and he calls us to trust him with our lives. The message of sacrifice is not just about forgiveness of sins. It's also about our response to God after we've been forgiven, what we give of ourselves. I want to circle back to the first story that we had. So the four guys on the lifeboat, and I thought this was really cool when I read through the result of the trial. I'm not sure that it would go the same way today, but impressed with the jury of 1884. So it's pretty neat. I'm going to share you the results of the trial here. So this is the Dudley and Stevens, the two accused. The defense argued on behalf of them as follows. The facts found on the special verdict show that the prisoners were not guilty of murder at the time when they killed Parker, but killed him under the pressure of necessity. Necessity will excuse an act which would otherwise be a crime. The law as to compulsion by necessity is further explained, has precedent in the case of two drowning men on a plank large enough to support only one, and one thrusting the other off, the survivor could not be subjected to legal punishment. In the American case of the United States versus Holmes, the proposition that a passenger on board a vessel may be thrown overboard to save the others is sanctioned. The essence of the crime of murder is intention, and here the intention of the prisoners was only to preserve lives. Here's the verdict. From these facts, stated with the cold precision of a special verdict, it appears sufficiently that the prisoners were indeed subject to terrible temptation, to sufferings which might break down the bodily power of the strongest man and try the conscience of the best. But nevertheless, this is clear, that the prisoners put to death a weak and unoffending boy upon the chance of preserving their own lives by feeding upon his flesh and blood after he was killed, and with the certainty of depriving him of any possible chance of survival. The verdict finds in terms that if the men had not fed upon the body of the boy, they probably would not have survived, and that the boy, being in a much weaker condition, was likely to have died before them. They might possibly have been picked up the next day by a passing ship, or they might possibly not have been picked up at all. In either case, it's obvious that the killing of the boy would have been unnecessary and profitless act in these cases. It's found by the verdict that the boy was incapable of resistance, and in fact made none. And it is not even suggested that his death was due to any violence on his part, attempted against, or even so much as feared by those who killed him. In other words, self-defense is not an option. There remains to be considered the real question in the case, whether killing under the circumstances set forth in the verdict be or not be murder under the law. And this is where I think it gets really good. Temptation to the act which existed here was not what the law has ever called necessity. To preserve one's life is generally speaking a duty, but it may be the plainest and the highest duty to sacrifice it. War is full of instances in which it is a man's duty not to live, but to die for those around him. The duty in case of shipwreck, of a captain to his crew, of the crew to the passengers, of men to women and children. These duties impose on men the moral necessity, not of the preservation, but of the sacrifice of their lives for others, from which it is to be hoped men will never shrink. It is not correct, therefore, to say that there is any absolute or unqualified necessity to preserve one's life. It is enough in a Christian country to remind ourselves of the great example whom we profess to follow. It is not needful to point out the awful danger of admitting the principle which has been contended for. Who is to be the judge of this sort of necessity? By what measure is the comparative value of lives to be measured? Is it to be strength or intellect or what? In this case, the weakest, the youngest, the most unresisting was chosen. Was it more necessary to kill him than one of the grown men? The answer must be no. It is not suggested that in this particular case the deeds were devilish, but it is quite plain that such a principle, once admitted, might be made the legal cloak for unbridled passion and atrocious crime. A man has no right to declare temptation to be an excuse, though he might himself have yielded to it. It is therefore our duty to declare that the prisoner's act in this case was willful murder, that the facts as stated in the verdict are no legal justification of the homicide, and to say that in our unanimous opinion, the prisoners are, upon this special verdict, guilty of murder. So at the time, the sentence, or excuse me, the result of murder was to be put to death. However, the court, because of the special circumstances, sort of went back on that, and they commuted the sentence to 6 months imprisonment for those two gentlemen. So, circling back to some of the stuff from Romans 12 that we looked at. Paul's exhortation is especially interesting in light of what precedes it, I think. Chapter 11 concludes a lengthy dissertation on the sort of doctrinal foundation of Christianity, showing the central importance of faith and grace. Instruction in the practical aspect of Christian living begins with chapter 12, and the two sections are linked by the word therefore. So Paul is demonstrating that the way we are to live is inseparably bound to what we believe. Faith without works is dead, and works without a correct belief system is vanity. Wrong thinking essentially cannot lead to right doing. If we drink in the spirit of Paul's doctrinal teaching in the first 11 chapters, then we are called to present our bodies as living sacrifices and to renew the spirit of our minds. So outwardly and inwardly, we're on our way to God's ideal for human conduct, and in so doing, are sacrificing ourselves for the greater good. Paul uses the metaphor of sacrifice throughout verse 1 of chapter 12 to reinforce both similarities with and contrasts between Israel's old covenant sacrificial system and our sacrifice, or the Christian sacrifice of our lives in service to God. Under the old covenant, the offerer's gift was presented to God and became God's property. Similarly, the gift of our life is set apart for God to use as he determines. When we are bought with a price, we belong to ourselves no longer. We're told that the Old Testament sacrifices produced a sweet smell that God declares in Leviticus in a number of different places to be a fragrant aroma to his nostrils. In the same way, the gift of our life is acceptable to God. Paul says that giving our lives in this way is reasonable, is of sound judgment, is moderate, sensible, and some of the modern translations actually say rational. The outward acts of a son of God spring logically from what has changed in the inner man. Our minds are being renewed, and therefore we are submitting to God's will rather than our own, and certainly then to sort of the conformity of the insanity of this world. The last word in verse 1 is service, and it's as important as any words in the verse. And in this context, it describes the service not of a domestic slave, but of a priest in complete self-surrender, performing his duties before God's altar. We're told that in 1 Peter 2. It means that we must first of all be priests by our inward consecration, and then we have to lay our outward life on the altar in God's service. Almost from the beginning of the Bible, sacrifice is one of the great keywords of God's whole plan and purpose. God clearly alludes to Christ's sacrifice as early as Genesis 3, and the first animal sacrifice occurs in Genesis 4. So this principle of sacrifice is woven into the fabric of every book. One of the keys is sacrifices are inherently costly to the giver, or there's no real sacrifice in the offering. David explains in 2 Samuel 24:24. He responds to Arona, "No, but I will surely buy it from you for a price, nor will I buy burnt offerings to the Lord my God with that which costs me nothing." And Jesus amplifies this principle with a statement where he says, "Greater love has no man than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends." It requires a decision that will from time to time bring intense pressure on us to control ourselves against our strong drives and go with God. If we do, however, God's promises to us are powerful, and we can be freed from not only from our nature, freed from Egypt to choose to live a life of servitude to God, but also freed from the sort of ethical muck that we can see otherwise, where I think it's a scary place to be when we're trying to figure out for ourselves what's right and what's wrong based on variables that we have no control over and no knowledge of. If we turn to God and we follow what he has put out for us, it really sort of clears a lot of the grayness up, and I think can provide great comfort. So I'm just going to conclude by reading a few verses here from Romans chapter 8 that I think wrap things up well. Romans 8, starting at verse 33. Who shall lay anything to the charge of God's elect? It is God that justifieth. Who is he that condemneth? It is Christ that died, yea, rather that is risen again, who is even at the right hand of God, who also maketh intercession for us. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or peril, or sword? As it is written, for thy sake we are killed all the day long. We are accounted as sheep for the slaughter. Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. For I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other creature shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord.